Hey guys, welcome to my video on support and movement, and this is according to the UHS 2018 syllabus and is made specifically for A-level students who are going to be unfamiliar with the FSC coursework, which will be the primary basis on which the test paper will be based. So not all of the chapter is included, bits are left out, and we as A-level students are really thankful for that. So let's begin. So I have the Punjab textbook with me, and you really need to be loyal to this book throughout this period. And here are these notes by Ali Raza, an ex-student of KIPS, I believe, and these are really great. I found these on the internet, really helpful. For this chapter, they're a bit more extensive than they need to be, but for the rest of them, for most other chapters, these are really perfect, really concise, and you have to do everything that is written. In this chapter, however, we can skip a few things. So you need to be able to define and explain what bone and what cartilage is. Now both bone and cartilage are what you call supporting connective tissue. However, they have different properties. Bone is considerably much more rigid compared to cartilage, and it's much more harder, and the reason for it being more harder is because of the deposition of calcium phosphate, right? And another thing is that bone has two parts. There is the outer part, which is the compact bone, and then there is the inner part, which is the spongy bone, and these have different properties. If you look over here, they have given this first division. Now the compact bone is really dense, it's really strong, and it's where the attachment with muscles take place via tendons, and we're going to talk about those later. Now the spongy bone is, in contrast, very non-dense. It's pretty light, it's rich in blood vessels, and it's highly porous. And here's another difference that comes up, because cartilages are not penetrated by blood vessels, so another huge difference. And in the cavities of the spongy bone, there are bone marrows where blood cells are produced. So when we talk about bones, we associate three types of cells. Osteoblast, they are the bone forming cells, right? And you would be surprised, because you would think that osteoblasts are the ones that would be the bone dissolving cells, but contrary to that, it's the osteoclast which are the bone dissolving, and the osteoblast which are the bone forming, and the osteocyte are the mature bone cells that are in the intermediate point when bones aren't being formed, neither they are being broken down. And this is basically what happens. Initially there is cartilage, osteoclast dissolve it, then osteoblast come into play to make bone, and eventually we have that. So over here is regurgitation, is the most rigid form of connective tissue, and here the collagen fibers of bone. They're basically hardened by calcium phosphate, and outer shell of compact bone, spongy bone interior, dense and strong, attachment site, light, rich in blood vessels, and highly porous. And same thing over here, however they have given the shape. This is what a stem cell looks like. This is how an osteoblast looks like. The one that is the mature bone cell, and then we have the osteoclast, which is the bone dissolving, and it has multiple nuclei. And then we have the osteocyte, which is a mature bone cell, and which is the most interesting to look at, with multiple cytoplasmic processes, I would suggest you sort of like memorize how they look like. Sight has all these branchings. Early in development, when bone is replacing cartilage, the osteoclast invade and dissolve the cartilage. The osteoblasts replace it with bone. As they grow, the matrix of the bone is hardened and the osteoblasts are gradually entrapped. So the very bones that are producing, the very cells that are producing the bone eventually get trapped inside the bone as the matrix, that is the inner part of the bone, is hardened. Now this is interesting and really MCQ worthy in my opinion. The thing with this chapter is that it's really something we haven't done at all compared to some of the others in which we are to some extent familiar with. Now, as expected, cartilage is much softer than bone. It is again a form of connective tissue. And where is it found and what does it do? It covers the ends of the bone at the joint. And the joint is the part where two bones articulate, and the cartilage is sort of like present over there at the ends of the bones. And in addition to that, it also supports the flexible portion of the nose and the external ear. You would observe that if you like take your ear and pull a little, the external ear is, well, it's, I guess, flap-like, so to speak. Same goes for the nose. It has a high level of mobility compared to the rest of our body parts. So, occurrence of cartilage and the ends of the bones at the joint. And if you feel like it, and because there is stuff we keep on forgetting, so where is cartilage found? You can write this down as well, and it's a good idea because we are really short of time when we're preparing for the MCAT. So if any stuff is really new to you, you should write it down. So it covers the ends of the bones, and repetition is the key. The more you repeat it, the more likely it is to stay inside your head. And over here they have told us about there being cartilage in the nose and the external ear, and two of these are stuff you probably are 100% already aware of, but the first one about it being present at the ends of the bones is something you are likely to be unfamiliar with. The osteoblasts are the ones that replace it with bone, and as the bone grows, the matrix of the bone is hardened. Why am I repeating this again? So the living cells of the cartilage are called the chondrocytes. And what do the chondrocytes, that is the living cells of the cartilage, do? They secrete flexible, elastic, non-living matrix collagen, which sort of like surrounds the chondrocytes. No blood vessels can penetrate. Now this is interesting. So what is the purpose of what is chondrocyte? Well, chondrocytes are the living cells of the cartilage, and I suppose they are sort of like the osteocytes, except the osteocytes don't quite do this. They secrete, these are important points, their secretion happens to be flexible, elastic, and unsurprisingly non-living cartilage. Matrix cartilage is the word they have used, and they've said that it surrounds the chondrocyte, the very secretions surround the very cell that has so produced them. And now they've told us these two main types we should be familiar with. The hyaline cartilage, which is supposedly the most abundant, and it is found at the movable joints. So what are the movable joints? Well, the knee joint is a movable joint. As we mentioned, that they are found at the point where bones articulate with other bones at the point where joints form. And hyaline joints, hyaline cartilage is the most abundant. Anyways, then we have elastic, and it has a matrix containing bundles of collagen fibers, and it forms the external pinna of the ears. And we know the epiglottis is basically just a cartilage, but you probably don't know what kind of cartilage, but no worries, we know now. So elastic cartilage is the one that forms, number one, the external pinna. I believe, I'm not really 100% sure about this pronunciation. I guess it's the pinna of the cell. The epiglottis, which we know to be a cartilaginous structure. And these are not 100% clearly written. This topic is not written in the syllabus, but these questions to come up from this topic. So I think you should be really careful when you read this. You should not miss out any point. And just like this, we have done one of the topics from this chapter. So let's move onward to the next part. Now they've given a lot of detail in this, in these notes, and I do not think they are particularly necessary at this level, or they are likely to be asked at this level. So feel free to skip it if you have these notes with you. Now when we talk about the human skeleton, and they ask you what is the subdivisions, you can say the axial and the appendicular. But before that, let's talk about tendons and ligaments, and you've probably read about them in O levels, but not in A levels. So when we talk about connective tissue, there is another class called proper connective tissue, loose and dense. Now, the loose ones are stuff you should not worry yourself with. In the dense, we have the tendons and ligaments. Now, tendons are what join the skeletal muscle to the bones, and the ligaments join bone to bone. The tendons are inelastic, and the ligaments are elastic, and this is really important. Tendons are tough, whereas ligaments are strong, and these terms matter. Composition, it's made up of white fibrous tissue, whereas ligaments are made up of yellow elastic tissue and collagens. Now I don't think the composition is all that important, or the structure, but no harm reading about it. So the structure of the tendons: dense parallel fibers and dense non-parallel fibers. And so let's move onwards to the axial and the appendicular. So when we talk about the axial skeleton, there are certain parts. In the axial skeleton, it's literally everything except our appendages. So it includes our cranium, which is just the skull, our facial bones. It includes our vertebral column, our ribs, and the sternum. So the skull has a total of 8 bones, and 2 of them happen to be paired, and we have 4 that happen to be unpaired, making a total of 8. So if we talk about the the unpaired. We have the occipital, we have the sphenoid, we have the ethmoid, and we have the frontal. And it would be a good idea to make use of mnemonics to learn this stuff. And as for the ones that are paired, we have the temporal and we have the parietal. And if you look at the book, over here, you can tell where the bones are. So here is the sphenoid. Here we have the parietal bone. This is the temporal bone. So now both the temporal and the parietal are paired parts of the cranium. The sphenoid bone, on the other hand, is not paired, nor is the frontal bone. We have the frontal bone, and that is sort of like our, like they say, our matha in Urdu. And then we have the sphenoid over here, and our temporal bone, and these are actually the temples. We have these, we call them simply temples in English. And right behind we have this occipital, and perhaps the biggest of them, the parietal. And again, I will repeat, the sphenoid is unpaired. We just have one of these. The frontal is unpaired. The sphenoid is unpaired. I may have repeated this. The sphenoid is unpaired. The temporal is paired. The frontal is unpaired. The occipital is similarly unpaired. The ethmoid is also unpaired. It's over here. You can't see it from the angle they've presented it. And that's it. So we can also call these other stuff. And then the skull is part of it. Now we come to the facial part of the skull. So when we talk about the skull, we do sort of include both the facial part and the cranium. So if they ask you how many bones are in the skull, you don't just say 8, you say 22, because the skull includes the cranium and the facial bones. And this is a mistake I could expect people to make. So write this down. The skull includes the cranium plus the facial bones. So we have 14 facial bones. Of these, 6 happen to be paired and 2 are unpaired. So what are the names of the 6 paired? Well, we have the nasal, the zygomatic, we have the mandible, we have the maxillary, and we have lots of these. But if we talk about them in terms of the division, so which ones are unpaired? The unpaired is the mandible and the vomer. As for the paired, we have the nasal, the lacrimal, the inferior concha, we have the palatine, we have the zygomatic, and we have the lacrimal. So I believe that makes 6. I may have missed them out. Hard to see all of them under pressure. So we have the palatine, we have 2 of these, maxilla, 2 of these, lacrimal, 2 of these, nasal, 2 of these, inferior concha, 2 of these, zygomatic, 2 of these, 1 mandible and 1 vomer, in total 14. And if you look at these over here, these have colloquial names and which are really helpful in remembering where they are. The maxilla is basically the bone that covers the teeth. So this is the maxilla, and remember the maxilla is a paired bone. Then we have the bone of the eyeball, which is lacrimal. Over here is lacrimal, and remember the lacrimal is similarly paired. Then we have the zygomatic, which is cheekbone, and here it is, and it is similarly paired. After this, we have the mandible, which is the lower jawbone right over here, and this is fixed bone, and we just have one of these, so it's unpaired. Then we have the inferior concha, which is the inner nasal bone. I wonder if it's shown over here. No, it's not shown over here. It's because it's sort of like inward, so it's not really apparent in this diagram. But you should know that it is the inner nasal bone. If you have difficulty remembering, let's take a look over here. It starts with I, and over here we have I as well. And over there, here they've written that the mandible is the only movable bone in the skull, but I believe this to be an error. Then we have the bones of the upper buccal cavity. So it's kind of like inwards over here or somewhere, and that is basically the hard palate or the roof of the mouth, and that is the palatine. Like palate should be easy enough to remember, and the vomer is the bone between the palatines, right? So it's sort of like in the middle, and that's why we just have one of these, palatine. And the breastbone, now we've gone on to something that is not part of it. Let's see, we have done all of that. Now we have talked about the skull, which includes the cranium and the facial bones. Let's talk about the vertebra. And the vertebral column is made up of 33 vertebrae, and they are divided into 4 regions according to the part of the body they are present in. We have the cervical. We have 7 cervical bones, and in the book the names of the first 2 are written. The first is the atlas, and the second is the axis. And remember, this way in mythology, Atlas, this I guess this kind of a god is holding up the planet, and his hands are at the axis, so sort of like Atlas comes first, doesn't he? It's easy for me to remember which is C1 and which is C2. After cervical, there is the thoracic, and obviously easy to remember because the thorax comes afterwards, and we have 12 of these. And then there is the lumbar, and we have 5 of these, and because 12 minus 7 is 5, it's easy for me to remember this way. And then we have the lumbar, which has, oh my apologies, I've already told about that. Lumbar has 5, and then we have the pelvic, which has 9. And the ones that are at the pelvic region, they are divided into 2 groups, the sacrum and the coccyx, and the 4 bones at the posterior end are fused together, and the 5 bones at the anterior end are sort of like fused together, and the ones that are at the anterior end, they form what is called the coccyx and the sacrum, and the other 4, they form this fused structure called the coccyx, and the coccyx is also known as the tailbone. So that makes a total of 33. And yes, the sternum is a breastbone. That is similarly important, but that is going to be more important when we come on to the ribs. So you should know that the vertebra has 4 curvatures, which gives it added strength. And you should know that the vertebral column is actually, it extends from the skull to the pelvis. So if they ask you from what point to which point they're extending, it's from the skull to the pelvis. Again, something you should write down. The vertebral column extends from the skull to the pelvis. Unfortunately, they are very picky about the stuff they ask from the book, so they're gonna pick up book lines left and right. So normally the vertebral column has 4 apertures, my apologies, curvatures, and this provides more strength than the straight column. 33 vertebra according to their location in the body, and this can be an MCQ, that the vertebra are named according to what criteria. So cervical, 7 vertebra lie in the neck region. First 2 are the atlas and the axis. 12 thoracic, 5 lumbar, and 9 pelvic, and they form 2 sets, the sacrum and the coccyx. The sacrum is formed by the fusion of the anterior 5 vertebra, whereas the coccyx is formed by the fusion of the 4 posterior. If we take a look at the diagram, this right over here is the coccyx, which is also colloquially called the tailbone. This over here is the sacrum part of it, and this is the vertebral column, which is extending from the skull to the pelvis. So this is pretty much it, and I'll be continuing this video after a break. And now for the last part of the axial skeleton, which is include the ribs and the sternum. So we have 12 pair of ribs, and so 24 in total, and we have 1 sternum, that is 1 breastbone, right? And they're basically, you can say there are 3 types of rib bones, and that is on the basis of them being attached, free, or attached is true, free is floating, and the third one is false. And the breastbone is the sternum. Now if you look over here, this is the sternum, and the ribs are attached to it. Now some of them are attached directly, some of them are attached via something called the costal arc, and some are free floating. So 10 pairs of bones are attached either to the sternum or via the costal arc, and we have 2 pairs which are free floating. So that's literally it. See, let's see if there's any detail. 12 pair of ribs that articulate with the thoracic vertebra, and this is important. So they can ask you, what do the ribs articulate with, and you'd be confused, and so 12 pairs of ribs articulate sort of like this, mutual movement against each other. Articulate with or against the thoracic vertebra. And how many thoracic vertebra do we have? We have 12. 10 of them connect anteriorly with the sternum, either directly or through the costal arc, and the lower 2 pairs are called the floating ribs, and they do not attach to the sternum, and the chest cavity has been so described as a semi-vacuum chamber, right? And this is basically it. And if now we talk about the second part of the skeleton, which is the appendicular skeleton, and consists of the appendages. So the appendicular skeleton, it consists of the pelvic girdle, the pectoral girdle, the hind limb, and the forelimb, so to speak, right? So we have the pectoral girdle, And what it is made up of? It is made up of 2 scapula in total and 1 clavicle. So if they ask you how many bones make up the pectoral girdle, you should be able to easily say 4. Now one pectoral girdle is made up of 2 of them, but in total we have 4. And if we look over here, this over here is the clavicle or the collarbone, and the scapula is this triangle shaped thing over here, which is also called the shoulder bone. And these 2 bones, they make up what we call the pectoral girdle and then we have the forelimbs, and we have 2 humerus, 2 radius, 2 ulna, 16 carpals, 10 metacarpals, 28 phalanges. And now let me elaborate. So over here we have the humerus. My apologies, this is the humerus, and this is the globular head, and this sort of fits into the pectoral girdle and forms a ball and socket joint. And over here at its distal end we have a hinge joint with 2 bones, the radius and the ulna. The ulna is this one and the radius is this one, and the radius and the ulna, they also have a joint with each other called the pivot joint, and sort of like allows their rotation relative to each other, which is why when you are standing with your palm upright, the ulna will be facing you, but if you turn it over, the palm is in the other direction, the ulna will be facing away from you. And this is something we've read in A levels, I think, already. So then we have, after the 1 radius, 1 ulna, 1 radius, we have 8 carpals. Now 8 carpals, and these are the wrist bones. And after 8 carpals we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 metacarpals, and these form the framework of the palm. And then we have 5 rows of 14 phalanges. So obviously in each row there aren't an equal number of phalanges, but in total we have 5 rows consisting in total of 14 phalanges. And that's literally it. And then we talk about the pelvic girdle, and this is the pelvic girdle, and it's made up of 2 coxal bones that are joined together. And the point that they are joined together, obviously whenever 2 bones are joined together, we've talked about there being this joint, and the sort of joint that is present over here is what we call a cartilaginous joint. And specifically this is a fibrous cartilaginous joint which is present at the point where the 2 coxal bones meet. Now the coxal bones are actually made up of 3 bones, the ilium, the ischium, and then there is this third one which is the pubis, I think. Let's look over here too. Ilium, the ischium, and the pubis. And reiteration of what we've said, the shoulder bone is the scapula, the collarbone is the clavicle, the arm bone is the humerus. Then over here is the femur's globular head is sort of like joint over here and forms another ball and socket joint, which is a type of joint which allows maximum rotation, is freely movable, so to speak. Then we have the femur, which is the leg bone, actually the thigh bone, not the leg bone, and that is the largest bone in the body. And then at the distal end of the femur we have a joint which is again a hinge joint. This over here is the patella or the kneecap, and then we have the tibia, which is the bigger one, and then we have the fibula, and once more they have the pivot joint, Then we have the carpals. This time, instead of there being, no, my apologies, we don't have the carpals, we have the tarsals. And we have, instead of there being 8 of these, we have 7. We have 7 tarsals, and then we have 5 metatarsals, and as before, we have 14 phalanges that make up the toes and stuff. So let's review. Pectoral girdle comprises the scapula, the suprascapula, and this is, I believe, muscle, and the clavicle. And what the clavicle does, it connects the it connects the scapula with the sternum. The forelimb consists of the humerus, the radius, the ulna, 8 carpals, 5 metacarpals, and 14 phalanges. The humerus forms a ball and socket with the scapula, and they can ask you, with which bone does humerus form ball and socket? If the option it is written the pectoral girdle, beware, that is not the right answer, because that is a girdle, and if they've given scapula in the option, that is the right one. But by chance, if they've not given scapula and they've given the pectoral girdle, you should go with that. So again, something worth writing down. Humerus forms ball and socket joint with the scapula. The radius and the ulna, the distal end, form what we call a multi-stage joint. This is important. The name multi-stage. They may ask you what is the name of the joint. And 5 metacarpals form the framework of the palm. We have 5 rows of phalanges, and what is the purpose? They support the fingers. Anyways, then we have the pelvic girdle and the hind limb. The pelvic girdle attaches the hind limb to the vertebral column, and that is something they can ask you. And you can obviously see how that is happening, because it's over here. These are the hind limb, this is the vertebral column, so it's connecting these two. 2 femur, 2 tibia, 2 fibula, 14 tarsals, 10 metatarsals, 28 phalanges. Femur's proximal bone forms hip joint with the hip bone. It is called the ball and socket. Distal end forms knee joint with the proximal end of 2 parallel bones called the tibia and the fibula. And they form a joint with 8 tarsals, which are distally attached to 5 metatarsals. 5 rows of 14 phalanges of the toes are attached to metatarsals. So all of this is pretty important, a bit difficult to remember all of these, but with practice comes perfection. So let's review. The tailbone is the coccyx, and then you have the patella. The largest bone in the human is the femur, the smallest is the stapes. And the stapes is found in the ear, and the ear has 6 bones in total, right? So now let's talk about the joints, and these occur where bone meet. And what are the functions? They can ask you if the function of the bones is to hold our skeleton together, and yes, in addition to that, it also allows mobility, because if there weren't any sort of like seams or body, just bone, there won't be any point where we can move. Still worth writing. Joints hold the skeleton together, and allow mobility, because without them we would be all bone and no point where there can be any flexibility, any movement. And on the basis of movement, we can classify them into immovable joints, slightly movable, and freely movable. And we can subdivide freely movable into hinge joint and ball and socket. This is important. This further division is important. Freely movable can be further divided into ball and socket in addition to hinge joint. And here we have a diagram of these. A ball and socket, you can rotate it like this. You can move it like in front of you. You can move it to the left, to the right, to the left, to the right, to the side, or you can rotate it. As for the hinge joint, you can only do it like this. Like either you can move it like this or you can move it like this. Just as the same amount of movement that a door can be, because you can either move a door this way or that way. And a pivot joint is very similar. So it's just a rod that is sort of like this way, and over here we can't, unlike a door, we can't move it to one side or the other. We can just move it in one particular direction. The other direction is not possible. This is important. And I would say that you take a look at this when you have time. Right, so immovable joints, slightly movable and freely movable. And we can divide them in terms of function and in terms of structure. When you talk about the freely movable joints, they are the synovial joints. And the synovial joints include both the ball and socket and the hinge joint. I will emphasize the freely movable include what we call the synovial, and the synovial include both the hinge and the ball and socket. Right? So fibrous joints. Now fibrous joints, they are held together by short fibers embedded in connective tissue. They're fixed, they're completely immobile. This is not really important at this level. Occurrence, they occur in the skull, in between the cranial bones, and they hold or they attach the teeth to the jaws. These are held together by short fibers embedded in connective tissue, are present in the skull, and they fix the teeth into the jaws. And cartilaginous, we have two types of cartilaginous, just as we have two types of cartilage, and one type is hyaline cartilage, the other cartilaginous joints, and the other is fibrous cartilaginous. And while these don't allow any movement at all, these allow some measure of movement. Now, where does hyaline cartilage occur? It occurs between growing bones. And where does fibrous cartilage occur? At the points where the coxal bones meet. Synovial. Now synovial have a cavity filled with fluid. And the cavity that is filled with fluid, the name of the fluid is synovial fluid, and it sort of reduces friction between the bones. That is the purpose. And the synovial membrane, that is the fluid, is double membranous. So the outer layer is connective tissue, fibrous capsule, which is the connective tissue, and the inner layer is the synovial membrane. Now the fibrous capsule is like at the outer end, and at the inner we have the synovial membrane, which is in contact with it, and as part of the fibrous capsule is modified into a ligament. Types: hinge, ball and socket, and to some extent pivot. Others are mentioned but not really important at this stage. So these joints contain a cavity filled with fluid, adapted to reduce friction between moving joints. And the joint is surrounded by a layer of connective tissue called the fibrous capsule, and the inner layer is the synovial membrane. So at the joint we will have this layer of connective tissue like this, and this layer of connective tissue is called the fibrous capsule, and at the inner end we have the synovial membrane, where we have the fluid, that is the synovial fluid, which functions to reduce friction, and some parts of the capsule may be modified to form distinct ligament which hold the joint bones together. And based on structure and movement allowed, we can classify the synovial joints into the hinge and the ball and socket. Now the hinge joint at least allows movement in two directions, like I said, quite like a door, and they occur at the elbow and at the knee. We need at least one pair of muscles at the hinge joint, and these are parallel to each other and parallel to the joint, so they're basically in the same plane. And one end of each muscle, because we have a pair, is fixed to the immovable bone on one side of the joint, and the other end of muscles, that is the insertion, is attached to the far side of the joint. The joint that allows movement in several directions, as I've said, you can go this way, you can go this way, you can go that way, or you can even rotate. And you need at least two pairs of muscles, and they need to be perpendicular to each other. And this kind of joint provides maximum flexibility, and examples are the hip joint and the shoulder joint. I'm really hoping that you found this helpful. If you have, please like and subscribe.